You think betrayal is loud. You imagine shouting, slammed doors, dramatic confessions. But real betrayal is quiet. It's waking up next to someone who smiles at you, touches you, laughs with you, while hiding a truth you're not ready to face. The most dangerous lies aren't spoken. They're lived. Most men don't lose their woman in one moment. They lose her slowly, while explaining away every red flag, every shift, every cold instinct whispering, something isn't right. And here's the uncomfortable truth no one tells you. Women rarely confess betrayal, but they always reveal it. Not with words, with behavior, with energy, with patterns. Today, I'm going to walk you through 8 warning signs that a woman has already been with another man. Not rumors, not paranoia, but psychological shifts that happen when emotional or physical loyalty has already been broken. And listen carefully. This video is not about turning you into a jealous detective. It's about protecting your dignity. Before we begin, take 1 second to subscribe, like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. Because betrayal doesn't care where you live. It follows the same psychological rules everywhere. Let's begin. Sign number 1. Her body goes quiet around you. There's a silence that has nothing to do with words. A quiet that exists not in the pauses between sentences, but in the very way a woman inhabits space around you. In the way her body responds, or doesn't respond, to your presence. And when you've shared enough time, intimacy, and closeness with someone, you begin to notice this language instinctively, because the body never lies, even when the mind does. You know her warmth, the natural ease in her touch, the subtle, unconscious ways she reaches for you without thinking, the way a shoulder leans, a hand grazes, a finger brushes, as if to remind you she's there and wants to be. And that knowledge becomes a silent benchmark, a gauge of connection. And when that language disappears, it doesn't scream, it whispers. But the whisper is no less real, no less devastating. She doesn't pull away with anger or drama. She doesn't announce a withdrawal. There's no confrontation, no fight, no obvious signal that something has shifted. She just stops reaching, slowly, imperceptibly, until your mind tells you it's a coincidence, until you chalk it up to fatigue, stress, routine, or the natural ebb of long-term connection. Your kiss lands, and she doesn't meet it. There's no warmth in the response, no natural pull of desire. Your touch feels tolerated rather than welcomed, a polite acknowledgement rather than a mutual craving, and her body stays still, rigid in subtle ways instead of melting in the comfort of familiarity. And the absence is loud because it is unnatural. Men are quick to excuse this, to rationalize it, telling themselves, she's just tired, she's stressed, or this happens in long relationships. Because admitting the truth, that the warmth you once took for granted has shifted elsewhere, is unbearable. But here's the reality most men refuse to confront. Tiredness recovers, stress passes, routines can be reset, but indifference doesn't repair itself. Indifference is not temporary. Indifference is a signal, a marker of where desire has moved. When a woman has already been emotionally or physically fulfilled elsewhere, she doesn't return to you hungry for connection. She returns satisfied, and satisfaction, like a flame already burned, leaves no space for what was before. Desire, at its core, is like fire. It requires fuel. It requires attention. It requires longing. And once it is burned for someone else, it doesn't ignite the same way again. You cannot recreate the spark with more effort, more patience, more affection, because desire isn't won back through effort. It is revealed through absence. And that is the cruelest part. The body communicates the truth long before words do, long before confession or confrontation, and it is in this silence that the truth becomes unavoidable. The mistake men make, time and time again, is to fight the silence, to respond with more initiation, more pursuit, more attempts to fill the void with the energy that once flowed naturally between you. They try to light a fire that no longer has kindling, hoping that persistence will awaken a response that is no longer present. The irony is brutal. The more effort you expend to revive something already gone, the more you reveal your own denial, your own willingness to ignore the signals that have been there all along. And the more you give, the less you receive. The strongest, most decisive move in this situation is not confrontation, not argument, not pleading. It is withdrawal. It is recognizing that the body cannot be forced to speak, that desire cannot be demanded, and that self-respect is more important than attempting to recover a connection that has already shifted. Pull back slightly. Stop initiating contact in ways that have been ignored. Stop chasing what is no longer coming naturally. Observe. Watch. Let the silence exist. And in that silence, clarity will emerge. If she still desires you, if her attachment remains genuine, if her emotional and physical investment has not wandered elsewhere, she will respond to the space you create. She will close the distance herself. Desire, when authentic, is drawn to opportunity. It seeks to return. It cannot resist mutual alignment when it exists. But if she doesn't, if her desire has already moved, if satisfaction has been taken elsewhere, the silence will grow, and that growth is a message in itself. It tells you everything you need to know without words, without confrontation, without proof. This is where the body speaks the loudest, and it is here that men can choose to reclaim their power, rather than continue to beg for a connection that has evaporated. The lesson is subtle but profound. Intimacy is more than touch, more than presence. It is energy, attention, and desire combined. And when any of those elements is absent, no amount of physical contact can restore it. Men often fail to see this because they conflate motion with connection, presence with attention, and effort with love. But the body communicates far more than words ever could. When warmth disappears, when the unconscious touches cease, when the body goes quiet, it is not a temporary lull, it is a signal. Recognizing this is not cruelty, it is clarity. It is the act of seeing what is real rather than what you wish to be true. And the paradox is this: by withdrawing, by stepping back, by allowing the space of silence to exist, you do not lose power. You reclaim it. You stop being the man who chases warmth that no longer exists and become the man who recognizes absence for what it is, who understands that desire cannot be demanded, who honors himself enough not to participate in his own diminishing worth. Observing without overcompensation is a form of strength few men understand. It teaches the other person the value of what they have lost. And more importantly, it teaches you the value of your own standards. Indifference, when recognized, becomes a mirror. It reflects where attention has shifted, where desire has moved, and how much self-respect you are willing to maintain. That reflection is harsh, yes, but it is liberating. Because once you stop lying to yourself, once you stop rationalizing, once you stop pushing harder for affection that isn't there, you free yourself from the trap of denial. In that quiet space, you can choose to protect your dignity, to reserve your energy, to observe patterns rather than chase illusions. Because desire cannot be forced, satisfaction cannot be recreated with effort alone. And the body, once it has gone quiet, speaks a truth that words may never convey. The connection has shifted, and your awareness of it is the first step toward reclaiming your power, your boundaries, and your self-respect. Sign number 2. Sudden obsession with cleanliness. When guilt enters the body, it doesn't sit quietly. It pulses, it manifests, it insists on movement and action. And one of the most telling ways it shows itself is through the body's attempt to erase evidence, to scrub away reminders of what has already occurred. Suddenly, almost imperceptibly at first, patterns begin to shift. Showers last longer than they used to, sometimes with no apparent reason other than the rhythm itself has changed, and the water becomes a tool not just for cleaning, but for ritualized removal of traces that might linger. New perfumes appear, scents you've never noticed before, layered and precise, chosen consciously or unconsciously to mask, to overwrite, to cover up. Clothes are changed immediately, even when it makes little practical sense. A shirt she wore for a casual errand becomes a candidate for laundering. even if it shows no visible sign of wear. Laundry, once mundane, suddenly becomes something guarded, private, almost sacred, as if the very fibers carry a secret that must be hidden, and access to it is restricted. Bathroom visits are timed with careful precision, moments of ritual that coincide with her arrival home, the subtle gestures of a person attempting to remove traces before any eyes, especially yours, can notice. On the surface, all of this may appear benign, even commendable. It may look like self-care, renewed attention to hygiene, newfound confidence, a subtle glow-up that could be attributed to personal growth or lifestyle changes. But psychology, especially the psychology of guilt and concealment, does not lie in isolated actions. It lies in patterns, in shifts, in changes to the rhythm of behavior that feel off when compared to the past. Skin holds memory. Every touch, every caress, every embrace leaves an imprint, subtle yet undeniable. Hair carries scent, whether natural or artificial, and it too remembers what has passed, absorbing and retaining the traces of someone else's presence. Clothes, fabrics pressed against her body, remember contact in ways that are almost tactile, almost impossible to erase without deliberate action. She knows this, and when she knows it, she acts, not out of hygiene alone, but out of a compulsion to erase, to scrub, to hide, to rewrite the narrative her body silently tells. This isn't about soap, shampoo, or fragrance. It's about removing reminders of another presence, removing evidence that her body has already told a story without her words, a story that she fears you might sense if left unaddressed. Men often miss this because they want to. It is easier to interpret a new perfume as confidence, a longer shower as stress relief, clothes being changed as tidiness, than to confront the darker, harsher possibility that this behavior is a mask, a ritualized attempt to erase guilt, to overwrite the traces of intimacy that belong to someone else. You convince yourself that she's just taking care of herself, that she's investing in her appearance, that perhaps she's finding herself again. And while any of these explanations could be true in isolation, psychology doesn't operate in single actions. It operates in change, in rhythm, in shifts away from the familiar patterns that once defined her behavior with you. That's the key. If this behavior appears suddenly, repeatedly, and without explanation, if the timing is inconsistent with prior routines, if the rituals are more precise than practical, if the attention to detail exceeds what is necessary for normal hygiene, then it is a signal that demands observation. It is not about accusing, not about confronting, not about cracking jokes or rationalizing away your discomfort. It is about noticing, about connecting the dots, about trusting your perception when something feels off. Guilt always overcompensates. It cannot exist quietly. It cannot exist passively. It demands motion. It demands ritual. It demands erasure. And the more intense the guilt, the more exaggerated the behavior becomes. You may notice patterns in the smallest details. She rewashes garments she's only worn briefly. She times her showers in a way that seems unnecessary. She applies perfume with almost obsessive precision. She guards laundry baskets and closets that were once open. She changes routines to avoid leaving traces. All of these are subtle signs, almost imperceptible if you are not paying attention, and yet they speak louder than words ever could. The irony is that these actions are designed to be invisible, designed to mask rather than reveal. Yet in their intensity, in their repetition, they expose the underlying psychological truth. Men, conditioned to see patterns in actions rather than rhythms of change, often ignore these signs until the pattern becomes undeniable. But the pattern is always there, visible to those willing to see beyond excuses. You don't need a confession to recognize guilt. You don't need her words to align with reality. The body cannot lie. Its movements, its rituals, its obsessive attention to detail are all reflections of the internal state that cannot be hidden. Shame, guilt, and the desire to erase traces of what has already occurred. Awareness here is the key. Observation is the tool. By simply noticing, by quietly connecting behavior to prior patterns, By understanding the rhythm that has shifted, you gain clarity without confrontation. You create the mental map of her truth without ever needing a verbal admission. And that clarity is powerful because it frees you from rationalization, from self-deception, from the trap of excusing behavior that is fundamentally incongruent with the person you know her to be. This is why sudden obsession with cleanliness is such a critical sign. It is not about hygiene. It is not about vanity. It is about patterns of erasure, rituals of concealment, and the unconscious drive to hide guilt before it becomes visible to the one who might notice. To miss it is to participate in self-deception. To see it is to reclaim awareness, to reclaim your perception, and to step into a space where reality is no longer negotiable. And once you recognize it, the choice becomes yours. To confront, to test, or to protect your dignity by observing quietly while acknowledging what is happening beneath the surface. Guilt leaves marks that words cannot, and the body, in its rituals of erasure, always reveals what the mind tries to hide. Sign number 3. Unjustified irritation and blame. Guilt hates silence because silence allows reflection, allows the mind to sit with discomfort, allows recognition of wrongdoing, and when a woman has crossed a line, whether emotionally, physically, or both, the last thing she wants is to sit quietly with herself and confront the reality of her actions. Instead, guilt seeks motion, distraction, projection, anything to avoid the crushing weight of self-recognition. And one of the most insidious ways it manifests is through sudden, unexplained irritation, where everything you do seems wrong, where your very existence becomes a target, and where conflict emerges from thin air as though conjured by some invisible hand. One moment, your routine is normal, your tone of voice, your gestures, your habits, all familiar. The next moment, the same actions, the same words, even the simple act of breathing, seem to provoke a disproportionate response. You speak, and the words are interpreted as criticism or insolence. You touch, and the touch is returned with tension or indifference. You move, and the movement is considered thoughtless or careless. Men often try to rationalize it, telling themselves that stress or fatigue or personality quirks are at play. But the truth is sharper. The source of this irritation is internal, not external, and its target is you. Because guilt seeks a vessel, a surrogate, a mirror onto which it can project its own discomfort. The psychology here is precise. This is called projection. She cannot face the weight of her own transgressions, cannot tolerate the awareness that she has violated boundaries, cannot bear the internal conflict of knowing she has betrayed trust. So instead, she transfers that discomfort onto you. You become the villain in her story, not because you have done anything wrong, but because assigning guilt externally absolves her internally. The mechanism is subtle yet relentless. A complaint about a minor issue, the dishwasher being loaded wrong, a tone in your speech, a missed glance, is amplified to a moral failing. A small mistake becomes proof of your inadequacy. And this amplification serves a dual purpose. It allows her to avoid the introspection she cannot manage, and it also manipulates your energy, your focus, your attention, because as you scramble to defend yourself, you are drawn into a psychological labyrinth where the real issue, the betrayal, the emotional misalignment, the transference of desire, is hidden behind a curtain of irritation and blame. Here is where men often fail. The natural response is to defend, to explain, to rationalize, to argue that you have done nothing wrong. You may think that logic, reason, and explanation will disarm the conflict, will prove your innocence, will restore equilibrium. But guilt is not rational. It is emotional, defensive, and self-protective. No amount of explanation, argument, or reasoning will relieve it. The harder you defend yourself, the more ammunition she has to justify her own actions, to maintain her internal narrative that she is not the transgressor. Your defense becomes a proof of your participation in the dynamic, a fuel for the projection, a reason to continue painting you as the antagonist. You may find yourself trapped in conversations that feel circular, exhausting, and futile, where the resolution is never reached, the conflict escalates, and your energy is siphoned into justifying existence rather than preserving dignity. The power move in this situation is deceptively simple, yet profoundly difficult. Do not argue. Do not beg. Do not try to reason away what guilt has decided to assert. The response that shifts the dynamic is calm, measured, and deliberate. A sentence such as, "You don't need to fight to justify something you've already decided," delivered with stillness and clarity, does something almost terrifying. It removes the cover that guilt relies upon. It strips the projection of its effectiveness because it no longer has a participation point. The more you stop feeding the narrative with defensiveness, the more her mechanism is exposed to itself. She can no longer comfortably hide behind your reactions because you have withdrawn the fuel that sustains the conflict. That withdrawal does not require aggression, drama, or escalation. It requires observation, presence, and self-possession. Silence becomes a weapon of clarity, a mirror in which guilt is forced to confront its own lack of logic. And here is the paradox. By refusing to play the game, by stepping out of the battlefield that guilt has created, you are not giving up. You are claiming power, you are asserting boundaries, and you are creating space for the truth to assert itself. Men often underestimate the subtlety of this move because they equate silence with passivity or weakness. But silence in this context is strategic. It is an assertion of agency, a refusal to be complicit in a narrative that diminishes your dignity. Guilt cannot sustain itself indefinitely when its projection is met with non-reactive observation. It begins to falter, to wobble, to expose the fissures that lie beneath the surface of excuses and irritability. Over time, this consistent non-reaction communicates a different message than argument or confrontation ever could. It says, without words, that you see the pattern, that you are aware of the manipulation, and that you will no longer participate in it. And that, more than anything else, shifts the energy in the relationship. The moment you disengage from the blame game, you reclaim your emotional territory. You stop being drained by the constant assignment of guilt and start observing clearly what is happening beneath the surface. You begin to notice patterns that were previously obscured by chaos. The moments of absence, the subtle shifts in attention, the inconsistencies in affection, the rituals that now feel forced or performative. All of these signals, which might previously have been dismissed as quirks or minor irritations, become visible because you have stopped filling the void with excuses, explanations, or defensive energy. In this space, clarity emerges naturally. You don't need to demand confessions because the projection itself has revealed its origin. You don't need to debate the details of events because the pattern communicates the truth more convincingly than any argument ever could. And here is the final truth men must grasp. The goal is not to punish her or provoke guilt. The goal is to preserve yourself, to maintain awareness, and to stop being manipulated into energy expenditure that only reinforces a system of denial. By refusing to argue, by refusing to justify, by calmly observing and stating the truth of the dynamic internally and externally, you create a shield that protects your dignity, your self-respect, and your perception of reality. Guilt thrives on engagement, on distraction, on manipulation of attention. When that engagement is withdrawn, guilt loses its leverage. The more consistent your calm observation, the more visible the internal logic of her behavior becomes, and the more clearly you can see the larger picture of what is happening beneath the surface. This is the essence of projection. It is not about you, it is about her, and the more you recognize that, the less you are trapped by the emotional chaos she creates. In the silence following your measured statement, patterns of behavior are exposed. Repeated irritations, shifting blame, inconsistent explanations, all of this becomes data, observable without emotion clouding judgment. And once observed, it can be acknowledged internally, and decisions can be made with clarity rather than fear, confusion, or compulsion. That is the true power of understanding unjustified irritation and blame. It allows a man to see the psychology of projection for what it is, to recognize the signals without participating in them, and to reclaim agency over his own energy, his own boundaries, and his own emotional state. It is subtle, it is psychological, and it is among the most powerful moves a man can make in the face of a partner whose guilt is masquerading as aggression. Because in refusing to play the role she assigns, he not only maintains his dignity, but he also exposes the true source of conflict without confrontation, drama, or destruction. And that, more than anything, changes the game entirely. Sign number 4. Her body reacts differently during intimacy. Sign number 4 is subtle, yet it cuts deeper than words ever could. Her body reacts differently during intimacy. There's a rhythm to closeness, a language that exists between two people who have shared moments, touch, and passion over time. A language built on unconscious signals, micro-reactions, and physical intuition. And when that language shifts, when the subtle flow that once connected you both falters, it tells a story far beyond the reach of conversation. You may notice it immediately or only gradually. A barely perceptible hesitation in her movements, a touch that no longer carries the warmth you once knew, a glance that no longer seeks yours but drifts past, or a kiss that lands without the urgency or reciprocity that once made it electric. It is in these moments that the truth begins to whisper itself to you through her body. Her arms may reach less often or linger less meaningfully. Her legs may shift away instead of curling toward you. Her breathing, once synchronized with yours in quiet intimacy, feels disconnected, irregular, as though it belongs to a rhythm outside the one you share. For those who have spent enough time with a woman, these signs are almost instinctual. You feel them before you can articulate them. There is an energy that exists in her presence, a current that runs through touch and glance, a subtle magnetism that draws you toward one another. And when that energy dims, when it becomes inconsistent or cold, it is not something that can be faked or explained away easily. The body is honest when the mind lies. It remembers what it has given, what it has received, and where it has wandered. It is an assertion of agency, a refusal to be complicit in a narrative that diminishes your dignity. Guilt cannot sustain itself indefinitely when its projection is met with non-reactive observation. It begins to falter, to wobble, to expose the fissures that lie beneath the surface of excuses and irritability. Over time, this consistent non-reaction communicates a different message than argument or confrontation ever could. It says, without words, that you see the pattern, that you are aware of the manipulation, and that you will no longer participate in it. And that, more than anything else, shifts the energy in the relationship. The moment you disengage from the blame game, you reclaim your emotional territory. You stop being drained by the constant assignment of guilt and start observing clearly what is happening beneath the surface. A woman who has crossed a line, who has allowed herself to experience intimacy elsewhere, carries an imprint in muscle memory, in nerve endings, in the subconscious mapping of sensation and pleasure. And when that imprint exists outside your relationship, your shared physical connection begins to feel diminished, muted, incomplete. You might try to rationalize it, telling yourself, she's just tired, she's stressed, this is just a phase. But these explanations pale in comparison to the lived truth you sense in her absence of enthusiasm, in the mechanical quality of gestures that were once spontaneous, in the hollow cadence of intimacy that used to be mutual. Men often overlook the small details because they are desperate for normalcy, because they hope that affection and passion will continue in the way they always have, because the mind wants to believe the body's silence is temporary, a fluke of circumstance rather than a symptom of something far more significant. But intimacy is not a series of isolated acts. It is a flow of presence, attention, and energy. When the presence is missing, when attention is divided, when energy is invested elsewhere, the body cannot conceal it indefinitely. You notice it in micro-movements, the lack of a shiver in response to your touch, the delayed response to your kiss, the minimal engagement when you draw close. Sometimes it is subtle, almost imperceptible, a faint dulling of sensation. But when you have known her rhythms, you feel the difference immediately, as though a familiar melody has been replaced by a faintly discordant note that unsettles your entire awareness. Sometimes the change is stark. Exaggerated reactions, forced moans, or attempts to appear eager when the desire is absent. These are attempts to mask, to cover guilt, to maintain appearances, but the truth leaks through. The eyes often betray what the body cannot hide. They are less focused, less connected, less present. The energy, that vital currency of intimacy, is misaligned. And here's the cruel part. Men often mistake effort or activity for desire. They confuse participation with engagement. They believe that because her body moves, because she responds physically, she is fully present emotionally, fully invested, fully desiring. But that is rarely the case when the mind has already wandered. Physical presence without emotional presence is an illusion. It is theater, a performance designed to maintain appearances while the fire has already shifted elsewhere. And the tragedy is that the more a man invests in closing the distance, the more he becomes complicit in sustaining the illusion, pouring energy, desire, and patience into an interaction that has lost its reciprocity. The mistake is thinking that effort can reignite desire that has already been sated elsewhere. You cannot relight a fire that someone else has already burned. You can only recognize its absence and decide whether you will continue to invest in a connection that no longer has the same energy. There is a subtle difference between desire temporarily dimmed and desire redirected, and it is the body that reveals this difference before words ever can. A woman who is still fully invested will eventually return to you, will seek closeness, will naturally align energy with yours, will show subtle signs of anticipation, urgency, and warmth. A woman whose intimacy has been partially or wholly given elsewhere will show hesitation, mechanical responses, delayed reactions, and an energy that feels fragmented, inconsistent, or distant. Men often misinterpret these as mood swings, stress responses, or fatigue, but they are signals of detachment, of emotional absence, and of a desire that has been redirected, whether consciously or unconsciously. Pay attention to touch. Does she reach for you willingly or out of obligation? Does she melt into your arms or remain stiff? Are kisses reciprocal and eager, or perfunctory? Notice eye contact. Are her pupils bright with engagement, or do they flicker and drift? Observe breathing. Is it synchronized with yours, or does it seem disconnected, unrelated? Every detail carries information if you are willing to perceive it, and perception, not accusation, is the tool here. You do not need proof of betrayal to notice the subtle shifts in intimacy. You only need awareness, attentiveness, and honesty with yourself. Withdrawal, once recognized, is a critical move. Step back slightly, observe the patterns, and resist the urge to overcompensate. Do not chase mechanical responses or force energy that is no longer mutual, because doing so only feeds the illusion, only masks the truth, only prolongs the internal conflict of denial. When her body reacts differently, your response should be rooted in clarity, not desperation. Notice without judging, observe without reacting impulsively. This is where strength emerges, in recognizing absence, in honoring your own energy, in refusing to participate in a connection that has been diminished without acknowledgement. Emotional and physical intimacy are inseparable. One cannot exist fully without the other. When her energy is absent during touch, when her body moves but her mind drifts, you are not participating in love. You are participating in a performance designed to maintain appearances, and allowing yourself to be part of that performance erodes self-respect, diminishes clarity, and blinds you to reality. Pay attention to the patterns of consistency and inconsistency. Sporadic warmth followed by coldness, sudden energy after absence, exaggerated engagement after moments of distance. These fluctuations are not random. They are indicators of guilt, of diversion, of attention being allocated elsewhere. Men often rationalize these moments, telling themselves they are temporary, that patience will restore normalcy, that effort can reclaim desire. But patterns reveal the truth over time, and the body always communicates more accurately than the mind. Once you recognize these signals, you can reclaim control over your own boundaries, energy, and self-respect. Withdrawal becomes a tool not of punishment, but of clarity. Observation becomes a tool not of accusation, but of awareness. And awareness, more than any argument or proof, reveals the reality of intimacy, desire, and fidelity. Her body's reactions, or lack thereof, are not just signals. They are messages, truths conveyed silently, and the strongest response is not chasing, pleading, or demanding, but seeing, recognizing, and adjusting your engagement accordingly. Because when intimacy shifts, when energy misaligns, when desire is redirected, your responsibility is not to revive what is already gone. It is to honor yourself enough to recognize absence, to reclaim your own energy, and to step into clarity, where patterns replace denial and observation replaces rationalization. The body never lies. The mind may spin stories, fabricate excuses, and rationalize behavior, but the body remembers. The touch, the warmth, the anticipation, the energy, it all leaves an imprint. And when those imprints have been partially given elsewhere, the difference is felt, unmistakable, undeniable, and unavoidable. Men who see it and refuse to act only prolong self-deception. Men who see it and recognize it reclaim clarity, dignity, and power. Sign number 5. Sudden excessive affection. Not all betrayal announces itself with coldness or distance. Sometimes it hides behind warmth that feels almost comforting. And that's what makes this sign so dangerous. Because when a woman has already crossed a line with another man, her guilt doesn't always push her away from you. It pulls her closer in ways that feel sudden, intense, and slightly out of place. Extra hugs appear where there used to be none. Unexpected kisses land on your cheek without context. Affectionate messages arrive out of nowhere. And "I love you" starts being said more often, sometimes with a softness that feels rehearsed rather than spontaneous. On the surface, this looks like reconnection, like she's choosing you again, and men desperately want to believe that narrative because it offers relief from suspicion. You think, maybe the distance is over. Maybe she realized what she could lose. Maybe things are finally getting better. But this is where emotional misinterpretation costs men their leverage. This warmth isn't coming from renewed desire. It's coming from internal discomfort. She isn't reaching for you because she misses you. She's reaching for you because she needs reassurance that she isn't the kind of person who would betray someone who loves her. In that moment, you're not being loved. You're being used as emotional anesthesia. The affection isn't about connection. It's about calming her conscience, because guilt seeks proximity to the very thing it's trying to justify. This is why the affection comes in waves instead of consistency. It spikes after unexplained absences, after late nights, after periods of emotional distance, and then fades just as quickly once the internal pressure eases. Love doesn't behave this way. Real affection flows steadily. It doesn't need a trigger, and it doesn't appear suddenly to cover silence that was never explained. Men mistake this pattern because they measure affection by quantity instead of quality. More touch feels like progress. More words feel like reassurance. But desire has a texture to it, and guilty affection feels different. It lacks hunger. It lacks depth. It feels slightly forced, slightly urgent, as if she's trying to convince herself through action rather than responding to genuine feeling. The danger is that when men accept this affection without question, they unknowingly step into a new role, not as a partner, but as a comfort object. You become the safe place she returns to so she doesn't have to fully face what she's done, while her excitement, curiosity, and emotional spark remain elsewhere. And once you accept that role, it becomes harder to step out of it, because every time you question the relationship, she can point to her affection as proof that everything is fine. "How could something be wrong when I'm being so loving?" becomes the unspoken defense. This is how men end up gaslighting themselves, doubting their instincts because the surface behavior looks positive, even though something underneath feels unresolved. The correct response here isn't rejection or hostility, but discernment. You don't reward affection that appears as a reaction to guilt rather than as an expression of desire. You notice whether the warmth comes with transparency or whether it replaces it. You ask yourself whether her closeness is paired with openness, consistency, and accountability, or whether it shows up only when suspicion might otherwise surface. When affection is real, it doesn't need to distract you from unanswered questions. When it's guilty, it functions as a distraction by design. Men who maintain their self-respect don't get swept up in sudden tenderness without context. They don't punish it, but they don't surrender their clarity to it either. They remain grounded, observant, and emotionally steady, allowing the pattern to reveal itself over time. If the affection is genuine, it will remain even when you stop feeding it with reassurance. If it's driven by guilt, it will fade the moment it no longer serves its purpose. This sign matters because it's one of the last places men expect deception to hide. We're conditioned to associate warmth with safety, affection with truth, and tenderness with loyalty. But in moments of guilt, those signals can be inverted. Excessive affection doesn't always mean deeper love. Sometimes it means deeper conflict inside the person giving it. And when you learn to distinguish between affection that comes from desire and affection that comes from fear, you stop mistaking emotional theater for intimacy, and you protect yourself from being lulled into silence by the very gestures meant to keep you from asking the questions that matter most. Sign number 6. Emotional absence during sex. This is the deepest cut because it doesn't announce itself loudly. It reveals itself in silence, in the hollow space you feel even while she's physically right there. Because her body may be present, responsive enough, cooperative enough, but her emotional presence is missing, and that absence changes everything. You notice it in her eyes first, not avoiding you, not closed, just unfocused, as if she's looking through you rather than at you. There's no shared moment, no mutual awareness, just motion without connection. And that's when the loneliness hits hardest, because being alone while together is far more unsettling than physical distance. Men often mistake this for tiredness, stress, or routine, because those explanations feel kinder and less threatening. But tiredness still carries warmth. Stress still allows moments of emotional contact, and routine doesn't erase presence entirely. Emotional absence feels different. It feels like she's somewhere else mentally, detached from the experience, disconnected from the shared intimacy that once made the relationship feel alive. This detachment isn't accidental. It's the result of emotional energy being invested elsewhere. Intimacy requires attention, and attention follows emotional attachment. When her mind isn't with you, it's because it's occupied, replaying something, someone, or a version of herself that no longer exists within the relationship. Men sense this instinctively, yet many override that instinct because acknowledging it would mean accepting that the relationship has already begun to bleed out emotionally, even if it still functions physically. The danger here is not the lack of passion, it's the erosion of self-trust. Each time you ignore that emptiness, each time you tell yourself it's nothing, you train yourself to doubt your own perception, and that's where self-respect quietly starts to leak away. Some men respond by trying harder, becoming more attentive, more accommodating, more eager to please, believing effort can restore presence. But emotional absence doesn't respond to pressure. You can't force someone back into a moment they've already left internally. The more you try to revive it by force, the more one-sided it becomes. And that imbalance slowly reshapes the dynamic. You stop being a partner and start becoming a pursuer, while she remains distant yet comfortable, because your effort fills the emotional gap without requiring her to confront it. This is why the sign matters so much. Emotional absence during intimacy is not a phase, it's a signal. It's the body going through motions while the heart disengages. And once that pattern sets in, it rarely reverses without a direct reckoning. Men who respect themselves don't ignore this sign, but they also don't explode over it. They slow down. They observe. They stop compensating for what's missing. They allow space to exist instead of rushing to close it, because space reveals truth faster than pressure ever will. If her emotional presence returns naturally, without prompting or reassurance, then the detachment may have been temporary. But if the absence persists, if the emptiness feels consistent rather than situational, then the relationship isn't struggling. It's already separating internally. Recognizing this isn't cruelty, it's clarity. Your responsibility in that moment isn't to rescue something by sacrificing your dignity, It's to protect your sense of self by acknowledging reality as it is, not as you wish it to be. Emotional presence is the core of intimacy. Without it, closeness becomes a performance, and connection becomes an illusion. Staying inside that illusion out of fear of loss costs more than leaving it ever will. Because every moment you accept emotional absence as normal, you move further away from the grounded, self-respecting man you were before you started questioning your own instincts. This sign doesn't demand confrontation or drama. It demands honesty with yourself. When her mind is no longer with you during the most intimate moments you share, the relationship isn't asking to be saved. It's revealing what it has already become. Recognizing that truth early isn't weakness. It's the last act of self-respect before denial turns into damage. Sign number 7. Late returns and empty excuses. Time is one of the clearest indicators of what someone values, because every choice about how we spend our hours communicates priority, whether we intend it or not. And when a woman has already emotionally or physically invested in another man, one of the first patterns you will notice is lateness that stretches beyond the bounds of coincidence. The first time she's late, you might dismiss it as traffic, work obligations, or an innocent miscalculation. And that's fair. Everyone has a busy life. The second time, you might begin to feel the edges of irritation, but still explain it away. Tell yourself life happens, she's tired, she has responsibilities. But once it becomes repeated, habitual, patterned, it's no longer about circumstance. It's about choice. Repeated lateness is intentional because it communicates, subtly, that you are not the priority in her day, and that message is rarely accidental. This is the silent test, the quiet experiment in your patience and tolerance. Each delayed return, each thin excuse, is an opportunity for her to measure your reaction, to see whether you will push back, question her, or silently accept the shift in the dynamic. Most men make the mistake of filling this silence with explanation, worry, or apology. They overcompensate. They give more attention, call more often, check her location, try to rationalize the behavior in their own minds in order to preserve a sense of normalcy. That reaction is exactly what she is observing and what she counts on, because silence teaches people how to treat you. If you continually explain away your worth, if you constantly cover for her absence, you are teaching her that boundaries are optional, that accountability is negotiable, and that your dignity can be postponed indefinitely for convenience. Men are conditioned to want answers, to want closure, to want the story to make sense. But the reality is that sometimes the story doesn't matter. The pattern does. It's in the repetition, the energy of absence, the emotional weight of excuses that don't satisfy, that the truth is revealed. And the truth is often uncomfortable. She isn't just late. She isn't just busy. She's prioritizing something else over you, whether consciously or unconsciously. And every time you pretend not to notice, you allow the dynamic to continue unchecked. The correct response is not confrontation in the sense of interrogation, nor is it defensiveness, nor pleading for explanation. Those reactions place you inside the framework she's constructed. Instead, the response is calm, direct recognition without embellishment, without justification. A statement as simple as, "You weren't here. That tells me enough," shifts the power back to you. It communicates awareness, observation, and self-respect without demanding a confession, without creating a debate, and without becoming entangled in the details of her story. This is the moment where presence of mind becomes more valuable than presence of action, where restraint communicates more about your boundaries than hours of questioning ever could. Silence after the statement is not empty. It is intentional. It is a deliberate act of reclaiming space, both emotional and temporal. Because when you stop filling the gaps with words, excuses, or reassurance, you force reality to present itself in the absence of distraction. The pattern speaks louder than any argument ever could. If she continues to return late, if excuses keep arriving thin and hollow, you begin to see that this is not situational. It is habitual. It is a reflection of her priorities, of where her attention has been invested, and most importantly, it reflects how she views your time and your worth. Recognizing this pattern isn't about paranoia, it's about self-preservation. Time is a finite resource, and allowing someone else to dictate its value relative to your own dignity is a slow erosion of self-respect. Men often justify the lateness internally, rationalize the behavior as circumstantial, or assume that love should excuse inconsistency. But repeated lateness is never about circumstance. It's about allocation of attention and emotional energy. This awareness shifts the lens through which you view all other behaviors. It contextualizes excuses, emotional distance, sudden affection, and the subtle changes that accompany emotional infidelity. By noticing and not overreacting, by calmly asserting recognition, you reclaim control over your own perception, and you refuse to participate in your own emotional marginalization. The power of this sign lies in its subtlety. Lateness on its own is not betrayal. A thin excuse here or there is forgivable, but a repeated, consistent pattern combined with the inability or unwillingness to acknowledge the impact on you is a signal of something deeper. It tells you who is taking responsibility for the relationship and who is not. The moment you stop negotiating for validation, the moment you stop filling silence with reassurances that aren't yours to give, you stop being an accomplice to your own diminishing worth. Time reveals truth where words can obscure it. It is unarguable. It cannot be rationalized away forever. When a woman repeatedly returns late with flimsy explanations, the pattern communicates in a language that cannot be denied. She has shifted her priorities, and whether consciously or unconsciously, she is choosing to spend emotional or physical energy elsewhere. Recognizing this doesn't require evidence, confrontation, or proof. Recognition alone, paired with silence and self-respect, is enough to realign the dynamic. By stepping back, by observing, by refusing to fill the void with your energy, you reclaim your own power, set the boundary, and force the relationship to reveal whether it's capable of honesty or only skilled in distraction. This is the essence of late returns. Not about the clock, not about excuses, but about your response, your boundaries, and your unwillingness to let absence redefine your worth. Sign number 8. Her stories start to collapse. The most telling sign that a woman has already crossed a line, that her loyalty has shifted, is when the stories she tells start to collapse under their own weight, because lies, unlike truth, require constant maintenance, attention to detail, and a memory that doesn't fail. And once that memory slips even slightly, the cracks begin to show. At first, the inconsistencies are small. A timeline that doesn't quite match, a name misplaced, a casual excuse that doesn't fully explain the gap in hours. Men often dismiss these moments, telling themselves it's stress, it's forgetfulness, it's minor confusion, because believing the alternative, believing that someone they love has been dishonest, is unbearable. But lies demand perfection, and perfection is impossible. Every time she constructs a narrative to cover an absence, an emotional distance, or a betrayal, she must remember the story she told last, the explanation she offered before, the tone she used, the exact words she employed. The cognitive load of maintaining multiple versions is heavy, and inevitably, cracks appear. You notice the shifts first in subtle ways, a hesitation before she speaks, the slight flicker in her eyes when she knows she's being observed, the way her voice rises or falls as she tries to recall the details, the small gestures that betray discomfort or anxiety. Men often make the critical mistake of waiting for proof, a concrete, undeniable piece of evidence that confirms what their instincts already sense, because the human mind loves certainty. But truth doesn't require proof. Clarity requires only observation and pattern recognition. It's not a single mismatched detail that tells you something is wrong. It's the repetition, the accumulation of inconsistencies, the patterns that emerge over time. One story changes slightly today, another tomorrow, and each change compounds the previous one. Timelines shift, events contradict each other, small details are omitted or exaggerated, and in the subtle language of the body, Her eyes no longer meet yours as they once did. They dart, they drop, they flicker with unease. That discomfort, that inability to maintain eye contact, is as revealing as any spoken confession could be. And yet men, desperate to maintain the illusion of stability, continue to seek proof as if a smoking gun is required before action is justified, when in reality, the proof is already visible if only they would notice the patterns and trust their perception. The collapse of her story is the ultimate test of clarity, because it removes the possibility of ignoring reality. No argument, no excuse, no rationalization can repair a narrative that is unraveling on its own. At this stage, the relationship is no longer about truth, it is about control. She may try to manipulate your perception with charm, with urgency, with frantic explanations, but the underlying structure is unstable. Every attempt to patch the story, to redirect focus, to convince you that nothing is wrong, only exposes the fragility of the construct. This is where the most dangerous mistakes occur. Men attempt to fix the story, to reconcile contradictions, to gather details that justify belief, when the only appropriate response is observation, detachment, and recognition. You do not intervene, you do not interrogate, you do not chase clarity from someone who is invested in hiding it. The moment her narrative stops making sense, your role is not to repair it. Your role is to witness it without participation, to allow the silence to speak, and to make a decision. Silence is your ally here. The collapse of a story creates a vacuum where the truth seeks expression. If you fill that vacuum with questions, accusations, or attempts to piece the narrative together, you dilute your own power and prolong the manipulation. If you remain quiet, if you step back, the inconsistencies reveal themselves clearly through pattern alone. Repeated absences, unexplained irritability, sudden affection, emotional detachment, lateness, hygiene rituals, and now, the unraveling narrative. Together, these signals form a web that no single lie could sustain. Clarity is not born from confrontation, it is born from observation and the willingness to trust your instincts. And when you have reached that clarity, there is a decision to be made, because the story's collapse leaves no other choice. You cannot negotiate reality, you cannot argue someone into honesty, and you cannot rebuild trust where the foundation has already shifted. This is the point where action must follow awareness. To hesitate, to continue trying to rationalize, to wait for further proof, is to betray yourself. You already have the information you need, and the longer you wait, the more you risk losing your self-respect in the process. Deciding does not require confrontation, dramatic exit, or justification. It requires acknowledgement, internal clarity, and resolve. You recognize the pattern, you see the absence of alignment between her words and her actions, and you allow that recognition to guide your next steps. Silence, once again, is key. You do not demand confessions. You do not force explanations. You do not chase after a narrative that is already collapsing under its own weight. You simply decide. Either you continue to tolerate the erosion of trust and dignity, or you step away, reclaiming the clarity and self-respect that cannot survive in a relationship built on repeated deception. This is the harshest but most liberating truth. Lies cannot sustain themselves indefinitely, and patterns, no matter how subtle, always emerge. Once her story collapses, the relationship is no longer negotiable, and the only remaining question is whether you will allow it to define your self-worth, or whether you will stand firm, observe with clarity, and act decisively. Recognition, silence, and decision are your allies. The collapse of her story does not require evidence. It requires courage, perception, and the willingness to honor your own reality above the illusions she attempts to maintain. After all 8 signs, the real question isn't whether she betrayed you, it's whether you'll betray yourself by ignoring what you already know. This isn't about paranoia, it's about dignity. Sometimes the relationship can be repaired, sometimes it can't. But no relationship is worth your self-respect. If this message resonated, subscribe, like, and share it with a man who needs to hear it before it's too late. And tell me in the comments, which sign hit hardest? Your story might save another man from losing himself.